Welcome to episode 123 of the Sports Geek podcast. This is part 2 of our special crossover episode with Adam Martin from the Makers of Sport podcast.
Welcome to the Sports Geek podcast, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host who loves working with teams around the world who need sleep, Sean Callanan.
Welcome. This is the Sports Geek podcast. My name is Sean Callanan, and you are listening to the Sports Geek podcast. This is part 2. So if you haven't listened to part 1, if you're like, what is he talking about? Go to the Makers of Sport podcast, episode 82, because I had a conversation with my guest here today, Adam Martin from the Makers of Sport podcast, and we did part 1 of this two-parter, this crossover episode. Adam described a crossover episode in part 1, but I prefer to describe a crossover episode in the way that I understand it, in the way that my son understands it, in the same way that Buffy and Angel used to have crossover episodes, or The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow have crossover episodes, where two smash hit shows decide to cross over and have guests appearing on other episodes. So that's what this is. This is part 2 of the Makers of Sport Sports Geek crossover episode. So if you started with episode 82, you are now here. Welcome to everybody who's new from Makers of Sport. And to my listeners who have never heard from Adam, please stop this right now. I don't normally tell people to stop my podcast, but in this case I will. Go listen to episode 82 and then come here, because this is a continuation. So I have got Adam Martin, who is the creative director of Mountain & Company. He's a graphic design specialist and consultant, and he's also the host of Makers of Sport podcast. Adam, welcome to the Sports Geek podcast.
I appreciate it, Sean. I really like your definition of crossover much better than mine. I'm going to have to steal that for the future.
Yeah, I know. When you're like talking about crossover, I'm like, oh, it's all about when Buffy and Angel crossed over, and it was like you had to tune in. So I'm
right.
showing
like some of the Netflix shows where you have the Daredevil pop over into into Jessica Jones or one of those types of things.
Exactly. I'm showing that I'm not just a sports geek. I am a bit of a comic geek as well. So we've had a bit of a conversation, and I guess you took the mic, and you were the host of the first session, and talking to me about my background and my take on podcasting and things like that. For people who may, they've gone and listened to the first episode and heard your hosting duties, but do you want to give people a bit of a background of one, what you do for a living, and then how you got into podcasting?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I, as you mentioned, am a designer. That is how I support my family and pay for the microphones for the podcast. I got my start, graduated from university with a degree in graphic design, and then worked at a sports marketing company, which if people that are familiar with the sports business, especially in the US, have probably heard of, called IMG. And so essentially at the time,
we've heard of that little company. It's got a bit of traction.
Little tiny,
nice little boutique shop, I think it's known as. Yeah.
Right. Well, so actually at the time, and this is what I tell people, because the company that I actually worked for, unless you're really familiar with college sports in the U.S., you probably hadn't heard of this particular company, but IMG College is what it's known as today. But I started at a company called Host Communications, and it was one of the top sports marketing companies in the U.S. Usually you see the Sports Business Journal do these rankings. They'll have Octagon and IMG, and then usually Host would come in third. And so what happened was IMG did not have a college sports division, and they ended up acquiring this particular company. So that is, and then that essentially became IMG College. So that's where I got my start as far as a designer, and then working in the sports industry. While there, I worked on a lot of print stuff, probably 70% print related items. So designing things like game program covers, media guide covers, schedule cards, posters, and that type of thing. And then also towards the end of my tenure there, I split my time working in the interactive group on some of their websites. So essentially, yeah, that's the start, and that's my start into sports as far as an industry and from the design side of it. I quit there after about a year and a half and started my own freelance business. At the time, my then girlfriend, now wife, we were not engaged or married, and I did not have the bills of the responsibilities of paying for kids or even other than taking her to dinner every once in a while. So I jumped right in and started freelancing and did that for 6 years full time. Still doing work in sports, although not 100% of my work came from sports. I still dabbled in sports. And then I, for a brief period, took a job when I was 29 years old. I took a job as a creative director at a small digital agency in my town of Lexington, Kentucky, here in the U.S. And essentially that was, hey, I'm about to turn 30. I want to see if I can actually work for someone again and give this a shot. And turns out I was unable to do that. I felt like I was building someone else's dream. And, it was nothing against those guys. I'm still friends with that whole crew there, but I just, had that entrepreneurial bug. Once you catch it, it's really hard to get rid of it. So when I quit there, I wrote this blog post and I can send it to you if you want to put it in your show notes.
Please
you gotta love how you gotta love how I'm aware of show notes, right? So most guests probably aren't even thinking show notes.
If you note to future guests, please send me all your links and please write the show notes for me. But yeah, thank you. That'd be terrific.
Right. So I wrote a blog post about how I wanted to challenge myself to do something uncomfortable. I was going back out again as a independent designer, consultant. And I've been listening to podcasts since 2006, and most of them have been design shows, business shows, sports shows. And there was always this show that I was looking for that I never could find, which was the intersection of sports and design. So, that encompassing everything from logo to sports logos, branding, uniform design, even sneakers. I grew up loving sneakers. I know that you also love sneakers based on your Snapchat posts.
Yep, I'm wearing the Sports Geek shoes version 8s today.
That's awesome.
The new Nikes.
That's awesome. So I wanted to create a show that really was centered around that, and so I basically did the research, found bought an intermediate mic from one of these podcast networks that I listened to, where the guy had suggested some things. And I thought, how hard can this be? I'll press record and upload this thing and we're finished. Right. And then lo and behold, I find out that is not the case at all with these, as you are, I'm sure, well aware. and it became much more work than I ever expected, but it has been a very enjoyable experience for me. And that led me to meeting you, which is kind of how we got here today.
So yeah, I'm really fascinated, and I listen to yours because it's, I believe that, it's adjacent to what mine is and what I do. So I'm in the sports digital space, working with sports teams, helping them build out better content, and a big part of that is the visual look and feel and the design elements of every campaign you push out. And it can make and break what you push out from a campaign point of view. How have you found sort of navigating that sports design space? And because you chat with both people inside the fence, in working in team land and league land on all things brand and design, but then also talking to agencies that service that market, whether it be in the market like guys like Aaron at Upper Deck, or external agencies that work in the world of sports. How have you found sort of navigating that space and I guess the appetite for that conversation and developing community around that?
Well, I think what I found is that it's a very diverse space, as far as what the word design means. And, initially I was thinking, well, design, logos, let's talk about people that do sports branding from a visual design perspective. And then what happened was, as I started to pay much more attention to the industry and just go deeper and deeper into this vertical, and especially just with the way the technology is today, there's so many interesting opportunities for design. Even recently, I came across a guy who is getting ready to become a Snapchat designer at Bleacher Report. And to me, I'm thinking that's such an interesting and intriguing position for me because, number one, what does that even entail? But that's, the industry is changing so much. And so these new opportunities are presented for designers.
So I'm going to stop you for a second, and you're going to have to explain, what does a Snapchat designer do? Is he designing filters to roll out for specific activations, or is it?
Honestly, I don't know. This is exactly why I want to interview the guy. But my guess is that it is going to be designing things like geotags, custom geotags for events, and then also, a lot of these brands are starting to invest in having those, stories that are promoted. And so there's a little bit of motion and stuff like that.
So I guess as a Bleacher Report being a publisher, if they're going to be a publisher on Snapchat, then they have to produce these motion graphic stories, versions of the stories that they're putting on their site. So it would be a slightly different, and there would be a brief for that on the publisher side. From a Snapchat point of view. But you're right. That's a job that did not exist in anyone's head 18 months ago.
Right. And I think that's one of the intriguing things about being a creative person working in sports, and especially a designer working in sport, is that there are always going to be opportunities available. It's just not going to be what we know of them today. I mean, one of those opportunities is going to be VR, virtual reality, augmented reality. We say the phenomenon of Pokemon Go, and a lot of people will play sort of down Pokemon Go and criticize it. But what I think a lot of people have trouble doing, and this is where I think the thinking of a designer comes in, is we sort of think about how experiences can be crafted from a usability perspective. Is okay. Well, here, the way I see Pokemon Go is I didn't grow up playing Pokemon, which is probably rare for my age. I'm 33. I was maybe just a little older than that particular demographic that was playing that. But I don't look at Pokemon Go as this useless thing. I look at it as here's an AR product that works. Now imagine if Upper Deck, we were mentioning earlier, made a card searching app that you could go and find rare cards, right? Like that could appeal to a completely different audience.
I think it's what Pokemon Go is doing for AR. It's a gateway drug for other, like you said, for other products. So rather than seeing it as a scourge on society, which some people do, you should be looking at, well, if people understand Pokemon Go, they now understand AR, they understand what it is. You don't have to explain it. So how can that be implemented in our vertical? And in our vertical, in this case, it's stadiums, and so it so fits in the stadium space that now, if you're a VR provider and lucky enough to talk to the guys at the Warriors, they're going to have AR integrated into their app when they roll out their new stadium, because it'll be an accepted piece of the puzzle when they open up their new stadium, and Pokemon Go is leading the way in that.
Right. Totally agree. And I think if you look at a lot of sports teams, this is why I'm actually really interested to see what happens with the Sacramento Kings in 5 to 10 years, because their owner is heavily invested in technology, and especially being on the front end of these things. They unveiled their recent uniforms in virtual reality, and it just makes me wonder, how much is technology going to play a role in the actual performance on the court or on the field, and especially the fan experience? I mean, we see startups now investing in teams investing in startups, and owners investing in startups, players investing in startups. Even the Los Angeles Dodgers have a startup accelerator. Yeah, it's a whole new world out there for us.
Yeah, I know. You've spoken to Dylan Boyd, who runs the accelerator at the Dodgers. Jack Elkins at the Orlando Magic runs an innovation lab out of the Magic. It is something that sports teams are seeing as well, we've maximised our revenue in all these other places. In some leagues, if you do too well, you have to put money back into the pot with an equalisation type fund. So there is an opportunity for sports to be in that startup space, embrace this technology, because if they do get one that goes really well, then they can have a stake in it or build revenue out of that. So I think it is a real space that more and more teams are seeing opportunities in, because really a lot of startups are attracted to the big brands, the big logos of sports, to say, look, this will be a really good first user, first client type experience, and sports has the ability to, I guess, flip that model and sort of be on the inside track of those startups.
Right, totally agree. And those opportunities are going to be available for designers, because essentially what happens, and what I've found through doing the podcasts and obviously doing through my own work, is that design is sort of the human layer of a lot of these digital products, in that, you have your functionality layer, which is the technical side. I know you come from a programming background, so you're focusing on how this thing works. But then designers are coming in nowadays and working with in parallel, and should be working in parallel if they're not, with the tech people, and creating the human experience, which is going to be how this thing is going to be used, how our normal people that aren't hardcore designers or techies going to be able to use this thing, this particular product. And that to me is exciting.
Oh, completely. And I think the real big trend on, I guess, user experience, both from a device, laptop, to in stadium, like that mentality that's happening across the board. The fact that people are designing experiences and they want stadiums to be experiences. That's where the design elements take it from, just an experience can really make it pop, can make it high end, but also looking to connect what is happening in the stadium to make that experience seamless when you go to your mobile experience. And that's the part where it's part design, it's also part UX, and the UX designers to be able to say, let's make sure that this is as slick as possible, getting the designer elements in, but getting that experience across for the fan, so it just enhances what they're doing at the game.
Right, absolutely. And I think if teams aren't focusing on that, they're making a huge mistake. I know that there are some owners out there that essentially want you to have your eyes on the court at all times. And the reality is that's the world doesn't operate like that anymore. That's the unfortunate reality that we live in. So you have to figure out how to use both. How can you play both off of each other?
Oh, and it's also that it is different. You've got different audience segments. There still will be the people that, and I'm one of them. When I go to a game that I'm engaged with, I don't pull out my phone and look at the stats or take a photo or tweet, because I'm engaged with the game. So and it's long been the Mark Cuban school of thought. I don't want anyone looking at their phones because I want them engaged with the game, because he is so focused on the game experience that he doesn't want people to be on their phones. But that said, there will be people that do engage and take in their live experience through their phone, like they are. Like we spoke about on your podcast, Snapchat. There are fans that will watch the game, and Snapchat is part of their game watching experience. So that's how it gets enabled. And so the challenge for teams is one, you've got to have the infrastructure to allow that to happen. But then how do you harness that and make that experience better? And it might be, like you said, having a cool Snapchat filter that's just on your stadium that gets put on, so those fans feel more part of it. But then they're also advertising your business. So you've got to serve, for every Mark Cuban and myself that just wants to enjoy the game and yell at the referee, there's still going to be the fans that do want to pull up the highlight and watch it and share it with their friends and brag that they're there. So you've got to cater for all the fans now, not just, I guess, the one or two points of view of this is how you should consume it, which does sound a little bit like old man yelling at cloud. You must watch. You must watch. You must watch the game this way, and you can't dictate that anymore. The fans dictate.
Yeah, totally. And honestly, I think that nowadays we're starting to come into an age where executives are starting to understand just a little better that business now, a lot of it is about building a brand and building and sort of having all these different touch points of the brand. And some of those things just aren't measurable. I mean, like, you're wanting to essentially create this tribe around your particular brand. And if I think a lot of people get hung up on Snapchat where, there's not heavy analytics in it, and that type of thing, other than seeing who screenshots or obviously who watches. But the thing that you're doing is you're telling your story, and brands and people love stories. I mean, why are children so in tune with Disney and Pixar, and even me today? I love going to Disney World and seeing the way that they do things, because it's all a story. It's a story that's crafted around this particular brand. And I think teams are starting to recognize that and do that.
So on that, and sort of working in the digital space, and I don't think there's a department more scrutinised from an ROI point of view, return on investment. It's like, you're going to roll that campaign. What's the ROI on it? You're going to roll out this Snapchat endeavor, or you're going to do this. Why? But how does from the design community? Because there is no tangible, take Surf Melendez with the rebrand of the Miami Dolphins and the slight tweaks around the 50th year in the heritage, and all the really nice pieces that were done around that. How do you do it from a design point of view? Do you tackle that kind of equation of why are we doing it, especially for the maybe the owner or the CEO that just says, we don't need that, the old logo's fine, or why do we need to change? How do you tackle that equation from a the bottom line point of view? Because I'm assuming that in the digital sense, it's still something that everyone's getting, trying to build up the analytics and things to try to justify it, but it's still a bit of a moving target. There isn't a set formula yet, but at least we can track clicks and data captures. I'm guessing it's tougher from a brand point of view when you're saying, here's what we're doing. We're doing this new story, and I'm completely agree with you as far as telling the story. But how do you tell that and sort of pitch that up the line of hey, here's why we're doing a new jersey redesign or a new logo or a tweak to the brand?
Right. Well, there's a couple different ways, and I mean, there's a couple different reasons why teams would rebrand. One would be just from a functional perspective. Maybe a logo or brand identity was designed in an era where there's a lot of gradients, a lot of bells and whistles that sort of were dictated by the software of the time period. And if you notice, I reference on my podcast sports logos in the 90s a lot. That's when Photoshop and Illustrator were sort of coming into their own, and people wanted to use that software to create, right? So you sort of push the limits to see what you could do with it. And then if you look at some of these sort of in the corporate world, just these classic logos like say FedEx over here in the US, or even just Adidas, these are just flat one color graphic elements. And I think we're kind of reverting back to that, where it's just sort of a trend thing if you look at just art and trend in art history. But from a functional aspect, you have now, used to be, it was when a classically trained designer would want to be able to design a logo that would print at the size of a dime. Well, now you have to design logos that not only are going to print at the size of a dime, but are going to need to be viewed at a low resolution, in a 20 pixel by 20 pixel box, right? So sometimes you'll see, so now we're starting to, and because of all the media, the digital media that's available, we have more flexibility in terms of creating these visual identity systems. So rarely will you see someone even come out now with just a logo. It'll be an entire identity system where, okay, we have this full combination mark, and then we can sort of pull pieces away from it to use in different executions. So, in our Twitter avatar, it's a lot simpler than say our letterhead or the front of our jersey if they choose if a particular team puts their logos there. Another reason why teams will rebrand is to just kind of re-excite the fan base. I mean, if you tend to look at a lot of these teams that are rebranding, they aren't really doing that well on the field or on the court, at least in the U.S. If you look at some of the NBA teams that have recently done it, especially. So that's definitely a reason that they want to get people talking again. And we sort of live in this era of what a well-known designer by the name of Michael Beyroux, he works for a design firm in New York called Pentagram, does a lot of corporate branding work, but he talks about the democratization of design. We live in that era. And so there's essentially for a designer now, there are two things that can happen. One, people like it, or two, people don't like it, but you don't want people to just not even notice it at all. That's the failure now, is if people aren't talking about it at all, that means that you really failed. But it's tough because when you create for an audience of thousands of people, you're never going to get a consensus. And so you just essentially have to just take the criticism and let it run its course. Because if you've done it right, then you've looked into your team's history, you've looked into where you want to go, you've looked at trying to develop what I refer to as a visual language, which are just these consistent visual elements that you're going to bring to the public eye. And so an example of this would be, I was talking to someone recently about even small things such as typefaces, and using the same typefaces in every single touch point of your brand. So if you choose a corporate typeface, your letterhead, your invoices, your emails, everything that you do is going to be set in that. And so to designers, yeah, we notice that stuff. To the common eye, they don't notice it, but they do notice when something's different. So if you think about when you get an email that's a phishing email from, say, like a PayPal, the fonts are going to be different, and you're going to notice that something just doesn't look right. And so that's sort of like the subconscious thing that plays into it.
So the other question I had, I've been lucky enough to sort of see the start of the sports digital revolution and teams sort of building out and becoming digital media organizations. And by that, the demands and the workload and the amount of throughput that is expected from the design and the graphics guys in the sports sense has just grown and grown and grown over the past, 5 to 7 years. From your discussions, from both working in the space, but then also talking with people, that are working on teams, they're now producing content. They're still producing the print. They're helping with the video side of things. They're producing all these digital elements for the website. They're producing all these graphics and requirements for all of these growing social platforms. How is the graphics and design scene sort of handling that burgeoning workload?
Well, it's tough for a lot of people. I mean, I obviously talk to a lot of people that are working in-house, and there is just this hunger for content, especially with social. More than anyone that, these teams are creating images that go with every post. One way that I have seen some of the people that have sort of been able to keep their head above water, so to speak, are creating these campaigns that are based around these more templated looks, where just from a complete functionality perspective, you're building out what the visuals that are going to be consistent with your look for that year. But you have these templates where you're able to maybe pass off to an intern or
a digital campaign person or a content producer type that's not specifically a graphics person, but they have to be able to open up Photoshop, drop in the photo, put in the score, hit the button, and away they go. Is it something that you're seeing more of the execution work from a graphics point of view being more handled by digital producers, social media producers, those kind of people, but you've still got to try to build out those templates so the look, the feel, the visual ID system you're talking about before is adhered to?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, not every time is that going to be the case. Obviously, I mean, some of these designers are actually even running social media. I know I have a colleague at the University of Alabama who is the basically the creative director for Alabama football, and he's running their Snapchat. He's posting on their Twitter account. So we've kind of come to an era where I'm trying to push designers to think more about strategy and less about execution, because execution, honestly, in most cases can be taught. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some people that, like Picasso was going to be Picasso no matter what, right? Because there's a little bit of, I believe, destiny involved in terms of someone just understands visual aesthetics and some people don't. But, for the most part, software can be taught, and we can easily teach people to pop in an image behind a couple layers and change the score, right? The main thing is sort of developing the visual strategy and really explaining to the people that are going to be using those images why you made the choices that you made, so that they don't feel the need to use their own subjective opinion and change things.
Very cool. And so in your before we wrap things up, because we've been chatting for a little while, and thank you for joining the two-parter. If you haven't listened to episode 82, please go back and listen to that. It was a really good conversation. I wanted to get some of some of the things you've learned from podcasting in the time that you've been podcasting. You're at 80 odd episodes now. What are some of the things you've learned as a podcaster?
So for me as a podcaster, I have really learned, and it's going to sound kind of funny, I've really learned to be a writer. in all honesty, I know that you and I were talking on episode one of this.
I have not learned that skill as a podcaster. Yeah. I'm still a terrible writer.
And you're mentioning that you like talking. Well, I do like to talk as well, but I've also I'm not as good, I guess, maybe off the cuff. So I've learned to really prepare and write, and also it helps me to sort of ideate what I want to talk about. Because one thing with podcasting is I really have learned that it's just like design, and branding, it's about storytelling. And what you're trying to do is guide your guest through their own story. And that has become a skill that after doing 2.5 years, or however many years I've been doing this now, episode 82 is going to come out. That's the skill that I've learned that I never thought really existed, is being able to sort of talk someone through their own story. Because there's a chronological order that I think just makes sense when you're doing a podcast, and it just makes it flow so much better. But as far as learning from people and sort of putting together these patterns more specific to the industry, that I work in, as far as sports design, podcasting has been a huge plus in that area, because I'm able to essentially see, what are these people doing? How are they running their processes? How are they running their processes? And then this may happen with you, I'm not sure, but it happens with me a lot, is when the mic goes, when the recording goes off, then you start to hear the real good dirt,
Oh, no, I never do that. All the best stuff ends up on the podcast, Adam. Never let people figure that out. No, all the best stuff. No, there's never any good stuff off mic. I only share the best information. No, I do understand, that there is some good conversations pre and post, but I do my best. Occasionally when I'm doing the pre-interview, people start talking and I just say, stop. That's good stuff. I don't want to redo it on the podcast. Let's get into it. So thank you very much. I've got to actually wrap this thing up and actually get back to work. And so we're doing got some client work to do, got some campaigns that I'm rolling out for the Olympics and things like that. So it's been a pleasure talking to you. Episode 82 was the first episode. Where can people find you on the internet, and where can they find the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So makersofsport.com is the podcast, and that's also the Twitter account at Makers of Sport. And then me personally, the best place to connect with me is on Twitter, and that is at T. Adam Martin.
That's right, and you can connect with Adam on there, or you can actually send him a message on the SportsBiz Slack, where he is one of the several sports business executives. You can go to sportsgeekhq.com/slack. We were slacking each other just as we were prepping this interview. There's always good conversations happening there with sports execs around the world. We've got a digital channel and a ticketing channel and a campaigns channel. So it's had a bit of an uptick from my recent US trip. So you can always chat to him on the Twitter or on there, and definitely give Makers of Sport podcast a listen, especially if you've got that design bent, or if you don't and you don't understand your designers and you're trying to figure out what they're talking about. Listening to Adam's podcast will give you a really good sense of what design is in sport, what brand is, and how it can help you. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and hopefully we will catch up in the future in real life. I don't know if I'll make all my way out to Kentucky, but maybe we will. Maybe we will cross paths in the future at a conference somewhere in the US.
Yeah, we definitely will. I appreciate it, Sean.
Cheers, mate.
All right, thank you.
Sign up for Sports Geek News at sportsgeekhq.com/sign up now.
Thanks again to Adam Martin, T. Adam Martin, on Twitter. You can send him a tweet. Please do. And one of the things that we sort of came away from both the podcasts is how much we really do appreciate feedback from people who listen. And I know that if you're running now or you're in the car, it's not the easiest thing to do to pull out the phone and send an email and those kind of things. But if you listen to Adam's podcast, please send him an email, send him a tweet, tell him that you do. And the same goes for me. Sean, SEAN, at sportsgeekhq.com. Will get me via email, or like I said, you can send me a tweet or send me a DM on the SportsBiz Slack, the growing SportsBiz Slack. Really loving the conversations that are happening in there. Post my US trip, some really good conversations around the digital. A lot of talk around the sports rights around Twitter and Facebook is happening in there. So you can join that up by going to sportsgeekhq.com/slack. And if you're in the Slack community, please share it with your colleagues. The more, the merrier. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the two episodes. If you've only listened to this one, please go back and listen to Adam's Makers of Sport episode 82. Well worth it. I really enjoy the conversation. And if you do have that design bent, interested in brand, then you should be listening to the Makers of Sport. It should be part of your listening lineup. Until next episode, where I'm going to have a bit more content coming out of Seed Conference, and probably a replay of the panel that I did, which I was very, very pleased with. I'm going to finish this podcast. The sounds of the game were from my time in Chicago. I went to the Chicago Cubs game on July 5 to see the Cubbies in Wrigley, and in the 7th inning stretch, they always get a celebrity to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." And one of my favourites from Entourage, Jeremy Piven, or as he's known, Ari Gold, he sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." So that is our sounds of the game this week. Same goes if you're at a game this week, last week, if you've got some video of some really great audio of you at a game, please send it in. I'd love to use your sounds of the game to finish off the podcast. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to the Sports Geek Podcast.
Like the Sports Geek Podcast? Find us on facebook.com/sportsgeek. Check out which teams work with Sports Geek at sportsgeekhq.com/clients. Please leave a review on iTunes. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/iTunes.